Hello everyone, welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're doing good and well. So for this Friday's album review, I'm reviewing the 16th studio album from none other than one of the biggest thrash metal bands of all time, one of the original Big Four bands. Of course, I'm talking about Megadeth and their release, The Sick, The Dying and The Dead, which came out today via Dave Mustaine's own label Tradecraft, and the album is 14 tracks and 55 minutes in length. Now in Megadeth, currently we have Dave Mustaine on vocals and lead and rhythm guitars, Kiko Loureiro for his second album on lead guitars, Dirk Verbeuren on drums, and Steve DiGiorgio taking over on bass duties after, of course, the firing of David Ellefson. And if you've been following Megadeth, you probably know all about that incident. So, being a long-time Megadeth fan, I would say, first of all, I enjoyed this album. I think it's another decent album from Megadeth. They have been very consistent over the years. Considering this is now studio album number 16, they're still releasing good albums, solid albums after all this time. I think that in itself is an impressive achievement for me. And they've only really got one or two slight misfires to my mind in their discography too. They've been a remarkably consistent band. And I still think that Dave has a way of, writing really good riffs and good hooks in his songs. On this album, I think Kiko really shines with some great soloing, and one of the sort of more standout aspects of this album being one of their newer albums for me is his guitar work. There's some newer elements, some newer dynamics in a few of the tracks. You get some cleaner style stuff from time to time in this album, which they've done before. Megadeth, they're not new to a cleaner, sometimes more acoustic based sound either, which you do get on a couple of tracks in this album as well, I think. And they mix it up, with some more melodic stuff before, usually diving into those really kind of heavy shredding. A lot of that propeller sound that Megadeth have when they're doing kind of shredding of those lower strings, there's that kind of propeller sound that you get, which I like to call it, which kind of reminds me of the sound that you get a lot of on the album So Far So Good, So What. And so this review has been So Far So Good, So What. Well, if I could say anything in slight criticism of this, it is that as a long-time fan of Megadeth, and this being the 16th album, I think despite some of those newer aspects of this album, like I was saying, Kiko, and his really cool solos and the cool guitar dynamics on this album, despite one or two experimental things Megadeth have tried on this album as well, and somewhat, I think, pulled off too, there is still something about this album that makes me as a long-time fan feel it's just a bit too familiar. It's almost like when I hear some of the riffs on this album, I find it hard to distance myself from those riffs and therefore perhaps pay attention to some and more of what's going on in some of the songs and the ideas that they're throwing oftentimes in this release, but still struggling to really attach myself to because I'm distracted because I think, oh, that sounds like a riff I've heard before. Going into the tracks a bit from this point onwards in the review, Life in Hell, which had a riff which reminds me a lot of The Threat Is Real from the previous album, Dystopia. Still a pretty good song, a song I enjoyed, but that's just one example. I think as much as I loved Dogs of Chernobyl, that was one of the more different style Megadeth tracks in this album with a few different phases to it as well, but there was certainly some riffs there that took me back to riffs, like I was saying, that propeller sound from So Far So Good, So What. There was, I think, a riff in Celebutant, which sounded a little bit kind of familiar to me, but still, again, a good song, but just one which, again, I couldn't distance myself from familiarity on the album for. But, still a solid album. I liked a lot of the tracks on here. Like I say, I liked Dogs of Chernobyl a lot. I liked Junkie, even though it had that chorus which kind of sounded, a little bit cheesy maybe, but I liked that a lot. On my first listen in particular, I really liked Junkie. I thought that's a good track. I liked We'll Be Back, the single, and that still to me is one of the standouts on this album because it has both, again, a little bit of familiarity to it, but towards the end they really develop the track into some really cool guitarists that felt like guitarists that were new, that were guitarists I hadn't really heard from Megadeth before, and I wanted a bit more of that on this album. I wanted a bit more of that, you know, inventiveness with those riffs, to just, you know, to make me feel that this is an album which is entirely different and something really cool as well. And as I say, there's tasters of that, but it doesn't happen quite enough on this album for me to give this, say, a really high score. So, in summary, I think I'll be giving this newest release from Megadeth a 7 out of 10, a solid 7. And you know, there were other moments. I liked Soldier On quite a bit. I quite liked the chorus. That's a slightly different style track, actually, to be honest. And Mission to Mars had a bridge that was a bit of a, kind of sounded a little like Killswitch Engage for a second on that track as well. They did a couple of covers on this album towards the end too. So, you know, there was stuff on here I liked. So I think maybe I've just heard so much Megadeth that it's just hard for me to appreciate something that's new, even with a few extra dynamics on. But that's just where I am with this album at the moment. That is my final kind of piece on this album. Do let me know in the comments what you thought of this album. You know, where would you rank this in the Megadeth discography? What were your favourite tracks on this one? You know, do let me know in the comments. And otherwise, there will be a Megadeth tier list coming up on the channel pretty soon. It is coming. It is coming. I've just got to revisit a few other of their more recent, well, relatively recent albums. I think particularly the ones in the late 90s and early 2000s I need to revisit again. But yeah, from me, take care everybody. Hope you enjoyed this review. Do drop like and subscribe if you like the kind of videos. Otherwise, from me, take care. Bye for now.